Welcome to Sleeping Radio, and tonight I invite you to rest, breathe slowly, and sink into one of the oldest stories ever told, a story whispered through ancient stones and written in the oldest surviving epics of humanity, the long and haunting tale of the fall of Troy. Let your thoughts settle as we walk into a world more than 3,000 years old, a world between myth and memory where heroes lived and empires burned. Scholars place the historical fall of Troy around the year 1184 BC, according to Eratosthenes, while archaeological layers at the site of Hisarlik in modern Turkey suggest a great destruction around 1200 BC that may match the legendary war. These dates come from ancient chronologies used by Greek historians and supported partly by modern excavations from Heinrich Schliemann and later archaeologists. And although the tale is wrapped in mythic figures like Achilles and Hector, the roots of the story stretch into real late Bronze Age politics, trade rivalries, and conflicts between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolian powers. For tonight, we will follow the calm, slow version of the tale as it appears across the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and fragments of the lost epic cycle. We will wander through the old city of Troy, through its shining gates and its shadowed halls, and watch a decade-long war unfold beneath its golden walls. Troy was said to be ruled by King Priam, a wise and elderly monarch who oversaw a prosperous city fortified by walls so strong that legends said they were built with the help of the god Poseidon. The city stood near the narrow strait we now call the Dardanelles, a place where sea routes connected the Aegean and Black Sea, making Troy a prize for any rising power. Greek kings from Mycenae, Sparta, Pylos, Ithaca, and Argos looked across the waters at Troy's wealth and influence. And though legend says the war began because of love, many historians see deeper causes in trade and control. But the story the ancients told begins not with politics, but with a wedding, the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, where every god was invited except one, the spirit of discord known as Eris. Angered by the insult, she tossed a golden apple among the guests, marked only with the words, "For the fairest," and from that single shimmering fruit rose a quarrel that would reshape the world. Hera, queen of the gods, claimed it. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, claimed it. Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, also claimed it, and the dispute grew so sharp that Zeus refused to judge. Instead, Zeus commanded that a mortal should choose, and his choice fell upon Paris, young prince of Troy. A shepherd at the time, and unaware that his decision would echo across centuries of storytelling. Paris was gentle and thoughtful, but no mortal could judge between immortals without suffering the weight of the choice. Each goddess offered him a gift. Hera promised him power and a kingdom over all Asia. Athena promised him wisdom and victory in battle. Aphrodite promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose beauty, and by choosing beauty, he chose doom. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and wife of King Menelaus, and Aphrodite's promise set events into motion that would lead straight to Troy's destruction. When Paris traveled to Sparta as a guest, Helen saw him with a charm that seemed woven by the gods themselves, and soon after, she left with him for Troy. To the Greeks, this was an unforgivable insult, not just a stolen wife, but an insult to honor and a breach of sacred guest friendship. Menelaus called upon his brother, King Agamemnon of Mycenae, and Agamemnon summoned the oath-bound kings of Greece, who had once promised to defend Helen's marriage. Thus, the great armies gathered. Some accounts say more than 1,000 ships set sail, led by heroes who still wander through literature. Odysseus of Ithaca, Ajax of Salamis, Diomedes of Argos, Nestor of Pylos, and the unmatched warrior Achilles of Phthia. As the wind carried the fleet toward the shores of Asia Minor, omens and prophecies spoke of a war that would last 10 long years. The old seers said Troy would fall, but only after suffering countless tragedies, and only after Achilles fulfilled his fate. For he had been foretold to die young, yet win eternal glory. And so the ships touched the shores near Troy, and the Greek warriors stepped onto the sand beneath the bright sun of the Bronze Age. Weapons shining, shields painted with beasts, and symbols of their houses. The Greek armies spread across the coastline and built their camps, setting their ships in rows while the walls of Troy shone in the distance like a promise and a warning. For many of the warriors it was the first sight of the city that would define their legacy, a place that stood high on its hill with massive gates and watchtowers that seemed impossible to breach. King Priam watched from his citadel, knowing that the Greeks had not come for a short raid but for a long and bitter war. His sons stood beside him, among them Hector, the greatest defender of Troy, whose strength and honor were praised in every tale that survived from the ancient world. The war did not happen in a single rush, but stretched into nearly a decade of skirmishes, ambushes, duels, and raids on nearby lands, a campaign that exhausted both sides and left countless unnamed soldiers lost to time. The Iliad does not tell the whole war, but focuses on a brief period in the final year, yet other ancient texts suggest a long struggle in which alliances shifted, friends were lost, and the gods themselves debated the fate of the city. Some favored the Greeks, others favored the Trojans, and each battle seemed touched by unseen hands, moving men toward their destiny. Achilles, the young and fiery champion of the Greeks, won battle after battle, and his name became a shadow that fell across the fields before him. But even Achilles was not beyond anger. When Agamemnon took a captive woman from him during a dispute over honor, Achilles withdrew from battle and refused to fight, and this single refusal changed the course of the war. Without Achilles, the Greeks began to falter, and the Trojans saw their chance. Hector led the Trojan army in a counterattack that pushed the Greeks back to the very edge of their ships, a moment of such danger that ancient poets described the Aegean wind carrying the cries of warriors as shields splintered and spears broke. It was during this desperate clash that the Greeks nearly lost everything as flames approached the first row of their vessels. To save his comrades, Achilles' closest companion Patroclus put on Achilles' armor and entered the battle in his place. The Trojans believed Achilles had returned, and fear rushed through their ranks as Patroclus fought with his friend's unmatched courage. He drove the Trojans back from the ships, saving the fleet from destruction, but the victory came with a tragic price. Hector confronted him, and after a fierce struggle, Patroclus fell beneath Troy's walls. When news of Patroclus' death reached Achilles, the calm sea seemed to hold its breath as rage filled the young warrior's heart. His grief was so deep that even the storytellers of 3 millennia could not measure it, and he returned to battle with a fury that reshaped the war once again. Achilles sought Hector above all others, and when the two met outside the Scion gate, the world seemed to grow silent. In the duel that followed, Hector fought with the dignity of a prince defending his home, but Achilles fought with the unstoppable force of a man fulfilling prophecy. When Hector fell, the defenders of Troy cried out from the walls as their greatest protector was lost, and Priam watched as his son's life ended beneath the rising dust. Achilles returned Hector's body only after Priam himself came to plead for it, a moment remembered in every ancient text as one of the most moving scenes of mercy in the age of heroes. Yet even with Hector gone, the city still stood, and the walls still defied the Greeks. The war dragged on into exhaustion, and both sides waited for a sign or a strategy that could end the stalemate. It was then that the Greeks turned to cunning instead of strength. They turned to Odysseus, king of Ithaca, a man known for his mind as much as his courage, and in the quiet of night, a plan began to form that would become one of the most famous deceptions in all of history. The Greeks would pretend to leave, but they would leave behind something that Troy could not resist, a parting gift shaped like a promise of victory. And within that gift would hide the end of the city. As the final year of the war unfolded, the Greeks grew weary of attacking walls that refused to fall and defenders who fought with the strength of desperation. Their captains met in secret councils, searching for a solution that force could not give them. It was then that Odysseus spoke of a plan so daring that even the hardened warriors around him paused to consider its strange brilliance. The Greeks would withdraw from the plain, sail away as if abandoning the war, and leave behind a giant wooden horse positioned as a sacred offering to the gods. The idea sounded like madness at first, yet Odysseus explained that the Trojans, eager for victory, might bring the gift inside their walls, believing the Greeks had admitted defeat. But hidden inside the hollow belly of the horse would be the finest warriors, waiting silently for nightfall. So the craftsmen began their work, shaping beams of wood into the curved form of a massive horse, a symbol associated with Troy's own traditions. The structure grew taller than the city gates and gleamed with newly carved surfaces that caught the last golden light of the setting sun. Inside, Odysseus chose men skilled in stealth and courage, including himself, and together they prepared to enter the belly of the creature. Meanwhile, the rest of the Greek army burned their camps to the ground and sailed toward the nearby island of Tenedos, hiding behind it so the horizon would appear empty. When dawn rose, the Trojans looked out upon a silent coast where Greek tents had vanished, and only the giant horse stood as a mysterious monument. They thought the war had ended, and shouts of relief echoed across the plain. Priam and his council approached the wooden figure and examined the strange gift with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Some believed it was a peace offering dedicated to the gods, perhaps to ensure safe passage home for the Greeks. Others, like the prophet Locoon, warned that something was wrong, urging the Trojans not to trust the abandoned relic. Locoon spoke with urgency, telling them that enemies who had fought so fiercely for 10 years would not simply surrender and leave behind such a treasure. His warning should have changed everything, but fate had its own path. In the ancient stories, it is said that 2 great serpents rose from the sea and attacked Locoon and his sons, a sign interpreted by the Trojans as divine punishment for doubting the sacred gift. With their only voice of warning silenced, the Trojans threw open the gates and dragged the horse into the city with ropes and cheers. Children danced around it, musicians played, and the people filled the streets, believing peace had returned at last after a decade of fear. Songs rose into the night sky as fires burned for celebration, and Troy rejoiced. Inside the wooden horse, the Greek warriors waited in breathless silence. The hours passed slowly, broken only by the distant sound of laughter, music, and celebration that drifted through the wood. Odysseus kept his men steady, reminding them that their moment would come when the moon was highest and the city lay asleep. Night deepened over Troy, and the fires of celebration burned low as exhaustion settled over the people. Soon the streets emptied, and the city fell into the deepest sleep it had known in 10 long years of war. Then, at last, as the moon reached its highest point, Odysseus signaled his warriors. They pushed against the panels inside the horse, lifting the hidden hatch and emerging into the silent city. Their footsteps were barely whispers on the stones as they climbed down and spread across Troy's darkened pathways. Far beyond the walls, the Greek ships returned toward shore, rowing swiftly through the night. That night would become one of the darkest in ancient memory. It was the night Troy ceased to stand as a golden city and instead became a legend told in hushed voices for centuries. And as the Greeks lit their torches, the last chapter of the war began. The hidden warriors fanned out across the silent streets, moving with purpose through the shadows while the city slept, unaware of the danger awakening within its heart. Odysseus and his men headed first toward the main gates, for they knew that the rest of the Greek army was already approaching from the shore. With careful hands they opened the locks and pulled aside the heavy bars, creating a path for the returning warriors waiting beyond the walls. Moments later, the Greek army surged into the city, moving swift and silent under the cloak of darkness. Their torches were unlit at first, for stealth was their first weapon, and their feet touched the stones like passing winds. Once inside, they scattered through Troy with deadly precision, each group knowing its task and each warrior guided by 10 years of longing for an end to the war. The Trojans awoke in confusion as the sounds of steel and shouting broke the peace of the night. People rushed from their homes, unsure whether the noise came from drunken revelers or a sudden storm, but soon they saw flames rising and shadows moving in deadly patterns. Their cries filled the air as warriors spilled into the streets from every direction. King Priam rose from his bed in terror as the echoes of battle shook the very foundations of the palace. The old king, who had endured 10 years of siege, realized that the disaster he feared had arrived not through open battle, but through a deception born from clever minds. His sons, guards, and servants tried to protect him as the enemy forced their way closer to the royal chambers. Aeneas, a Trojan noble whose story would later be told in Rome's great epic, gathered his family and tried to save as many people as he could. The ancient texts describe him carrying his aged father on his back while guiding his young son through the burning streets, a symbol of duty and reluctant survival in the face of calamity. Around him the city crumbled as roof tiles cracked from heat and towers glowed orange beneath the spreading flames. The palace fell soon after as Greek warriors broke through its defenses and closed in on Priam. The old king sought sanctuary at the altar of Zeus within the courtyard, but the sanctity of the sacred space could not stop the fury of battle. According to the oldest accounts, Priam met his end beside the altar, marking the symbolic fall of Troy's royal line. Across the city, men and women fled toward temples, hoping the gods would protect them, but the destruction was overwhelming. Fires spread from house to house as wooden beams snapped under heat, sending sparks into the dark sky where smoke rose like a funeral shroud above the city. Troy, once called the Jewel of the East, was turning into ash before the eyes of its last defenders. In the midst of the chaos, Paris, the prince whose choice had sparked the entire war, tried to fight once more, but years of hardship had weakened him. His struggles ended before dawn, a quiet closure to a decision that had changed the fate of nations. Other heroes fell as well, their names preserved in fragments of ancient poetry scattered through time. The Greeks took plunder from the city, gathering treasures that had been collected through generations of Trojan kings. Statues, gold, cloth, weapons, and sacred relics were carried to the ships as trophies of victory, pieces of a civilization that would never rise again. The war, which had begun with the theft of Helen, ended with the destruction of the city that had sheltered her. As the sun finally rose, its light revealed the ruins of Troy, broken walls and scorched towers silhouetted against the pale morning sky. The smoke hung heavy over the land, and the once bustling city lay still except for the distant sounds of warriors preparing to depart with their spoils. Only a handful of survivors escaped, including Aeneas, who, according to Roman tradition, would journey far and become the ancestor of future empires. The fall of Troy became a turning point in ancient storytelling, a symbol of how pride, passion, honor, and fate could shape the destinies of entire nations. For centuries, poets, historians, scholars, and travelers repeated the tale, blending history with myth until the boundary between them faded like the final embers of the burning city. And though the real Troy may have stood upon the hill of Hissarlik, the Troy of legend lives in memory, carried through time in the lines of Homer, the pages of Virgil, and the countless retellings that followed. As dawn settled over the ruins, the Greeks gathered on the shore preparing their ships for the journey home, though none of them knew that the end of the war would only be the beginning of new trials. The sea waited for them with shifting winds and silent omens that hinted at storms yet to come. Some warriors would never return home, for the gods who had guided the war were not finished shaping the fate of those who survived. Menelaus found Helen among the ruins, her beauty untouched by the horrors of the night, and ancient stories say she greeted him with a soft grace that quieted his anger. Whether she was taken by force or left willingly had been debated even in ancient times, but in the end she returned with him to Sparta as though completing a long circle drawn by destiny. For the Greeks, the return voyage became a new saga filled with shipwrecks, betrayals, and wandering. Agamemnon, the powerful king who had led the Greek coalition, sailed home carrying the weight of 10 years of battle. But at Mycenae tragedy awaited him, for his wife Clytemnestra had not forgiven the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia, an act Agamemnon had committed before the war to win favorable winds. When he stepped into his palace, she struck him down, ending the life of the man who once commanded the greatest army of the age. Odysseus faced trials of his own as he began a long wandering across seas filled with storms and strange islands, a journey later shaped into the Odyssey. For 10 more years he fought to return to Ithaca, battling monsters, resisting temptation, and outwitting dangers that rose from both gods and men. His return home became one of the most enduring journeys in world literature. As for Troy, the ashes cooled slowly over the following days, leaving behind blackened stones, collapsed arches, and statues cracked under heat. Archaeologists in the modern age uncovered layers of destruction at the site of Hissarlik, and many believe that one of those layers, known as Troy Via, holds the remains of the city described in the tales. Charred timbers, arrowheads, and fallen walls all speak of a violent end that echoes the ancient accounts. The survivors who fled carried fragments of their culture with them, scattering across the Mediterranean in search of new homes. Among them was Aeneas, whose journey, preserved in Roman tradition, became the foundation of a legend that linked the fall of Troy to the rise of Rome centuries later. According to the old stories, he traveled through storms and foreign lands to reach Italy, where his descendants would build a new kingdom. The memory of Troy shaped not only the myths of Greece and Rome, but the identity of later civilizations, who saw in its story a warning about pride and desire. The love of Helen, the anger of Achilles, the duty of Hector, and the cunning of Odysseus formed a tapestry of human emotion that scholars studied for centuries. Each retelling added new layers, turning the burning of Troy into a symbol of the fragility of power and the weight of destiny. Poets in ancient temples recited the verses of the Iliad, while travelers carried fragments of the story along merchant routes that stretched across continents. The tale crossed oceans, survived the fall of empires, and lived inside scrolls, kept safe by scribes who believed the story too important to lose. Generation after generation passed it onward, allowing Troy to live long after its stones had fallen. History and myth became intertwined as scholars debated which parts of the story belonged to memory and which belonged to imagination. Some saw the war as a real conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and Anatolian kingdoms at the end of the Bronze Age, a period marked by upheavals and migrations across the eastern Mediterranean. Others saw it as a symbolic tale that used human passions to explain the rise and fall of civilizations. Even in modern times, the legend continues to inspire excavations, novels, films, and research that attempt to uncover the true nature of the city behind the poems. With each discovery, Troy becomes at once more real and more mysterious, reminding us that ancient stories often hold truths hidden beneath layers of imagination. The burning of Troy remains one of the most powerful images of the ancient world, a moment where myth and history touch. And so, the story of Troy ends not with the fall of a city but with the persistence of its memory. Carried across thousands of years by storytellers, scholars, travelers, and dreamers, the ruins may have crumbled beneath the soil of Turkey, but the tale rose higher than the city's tallest towers and stretched farther than its greatest walls. For as long as people remember the struggles of heroes and the lessons buried in ancient ages, Troy will never truly be lost. Long after the fires of Troy faded into the quiet soil of the ancient world, its story began a second life, carried by the voices of poets who shaped the memory of the war into something larger than history. Each generation retold the events in new forms, adding details, changing perspectives, and deepening the emotional echoes that followed the fall of the city. In this way, Troy became not only a place but a timeless symbol of how love, honor, and fate can guide entire civilizations. The earliest and most enduring retelling came from Homer, whose epics were passed down orally before being written centuries after the war. The Iliad focused on a brief span of the conflict, yet within its verses lived the sorrow, pride, and rage that defined the entire decade of fighting. Homer's descriptions of battles, heroes, and the fragile bonds between men created a foundation for everything that would be told afterward. The Odyssey continued the thread, revealing the long and difficult returns of Greek warriors who carried the emotional scars of Troy with them. Through this wandering tale, the world learned that victory can come with its own burdens and that homecoming can be as perilous as war. Together, the two epics formed a mirror of the ancient Greek soul, reflecting both courage and longing. Centuries later, the Roman poet Virgil added a new dimension with the Aeneid, placing Aeneas at the center of a journey that linked the fall of Troy to the rise of Rome. In Virgil's hands, the burning city became the origin of a future empire, a reminder that even destruction can seed new beginnings. His retelling shaped the identity of Rome for generations, blending myth with national pride. Historians like Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus wrote about Troy with a mixture of curiosity and reverence, trying to separate memory from imagination. They gathered fragments from travelers, bards, and local traditions, attempting to reconstruct the world that may have existed before the Bronze Age collapse. Their writings preserved countless small details that might have otherwise vanished forever. Through the Middle Ages, the tale of Troy found new life in monasteries, where scribes copied the ancient manuscripts by candlelight. Artists painted scenes of Achilles, Hector, and Aeneas on illuminated pages, their gold-leaf borders shining like faint echoes of the legendary city's once glittering halls. Each stroke of the pen and brush carried Troy one step further into the future. During the Renaissance, European scholars rediscovered Greek manuscripts and revived the stories with renewed passion. Playwrights, poets, and painters retold the war in their own languages, weaving ancient themes into modern questions about love, honor, and the fragile nature of power. Troy became as alive in their world as it had been in the time of the ancient poets. As centuries passed, the story continued to evolve, reaching new listeners through novels, operas, and eventually films that brought the old heroes to life for modern audiences. The burning city became a stage on which humanity explored its deepest emotions. From jealousy and ambition to loyalty and grief, no matter how many retellings emerged, the core of the tale remained the same. Archaeologists in the 19th century began to search for the physical city itself, digging through the hills of northwestern Turkey in hopes of finding proof behind the legend. Heinrich Schliemann uncovered layers of ancient ruins at his Sarlik, and although his methods were often damaging, his discoveries began a new era of study. Later, excavations by Wilhelm Dörpfeld and Karl Blegen provided clearer insights, revealing multiple layers of cities built atop one another over centuries. Among those layers, one in particular showed signs of violent destruction consistent with a large conflict around the Late Bronze Age. Broken walls, arrowheads, fire marks, and collapsed structures suggested that a real event had shaped the mythic memory of Troy. These findings did not prove the war exactly as the poets described it, but they revealed that something powerful had occurred on that hill overlooking the Aegean. Modern scholars continue to debate the details, comparing ancient texts with archaeological evidence and studying the shifting alliances of Bronze Age kingdoms. Some believe the war may have been rooted in trade disputes, piracy, or rivalry between Mycenaean Greeks and Hittite-controlled lands. Others think it may have been a series of conflicts, later woven into one grand tale. Through every theory and discovery, one truth remains constant. The story of Troy endures because it is not only about kings and warriors, but about the human heart, with all its strengths and flaws. It carries the weight of choices, the pull of desire, the consequences of pride, and the fragile threads of destiny that others must follow. And so the fall of Troy lives on, not just as a memory of ancient walls and burning towers, but as a reflection of the world we live in today. It speaks of how cities rise and fall, how people chase beauty and glory, and how stories can outlast stone and fire. In remembering Troy, we remember ourselves, for the emotions that shaped its fate still shape the course of our own lives. As the centuries moved forward, Troy remained a puzzle that invited endless curiosity, a place where history and imagination blended so deeply that separating them felt like unraveling threads of the same ancient tapestry. People from distant lands traveled across seas and continents just to stand upon the hill where the city once rose, hoping to feel a faint echo of the world described in the epics. Even the silent stones seemed to whisper reminders of battles fought and lives lived in a forgotten age. The ruins became a symbol of human ambition, reminding travelers that no city, no matter how strong its walls or how proud its kings, can escape the turning of time. Every fallen tower and scorched layer of earth carried the imprint of the people who lived there, their hopes buried beneath centuries of dust and rebuilding. The site revealed not one Troy, but many, built one atop another, like chapters layered into a long and complex book. Families who lived near the hill told stories passed down from their grandparents, tales of lost kingdoms and buried treasure. Scholars listened carefully, knowing that even folklore could hide pieces of real memory beneath its decorative layers. In these local traditions, fragments of the ancient world survived in unexpected ways. As archaeology advanced, new tools allowed researchers to look deeper into the earth without disturbing the fragile remains. Ground surveys and microscopic analysis revealed charred seeds, broken pottery, and animal bones that painted a clearer picture of daily life at the time of the war. These small artifacts spoke of ordinary people whose lives unfolded behind the grand events remembered in legends. While the poets focused on heroes and kings, the earth revealed the presence of farmers, artisans, children, and elders who witnessed the rise and fall of their home. Their stories were not recorded in epic songs, yet they formed the foundation of the city that endured siege after siege. Through their humble remains, the ancient world became more human and more real. The question that fascinated generations was whether the Trojan War itself had truly happened as the legends described. Many scholars believed the truth was more complex, perhaps a conflict sparked by trade rivalries or political tensions between great Bronze Age kingdoms. Others argued that the stories grew from multiple wars that occurred at different times, later woven into a single narrative of glory and tragedy. Regardless of the exact cause, the destruction layer at Hisarlik told a story of fire and collapse, a dramatic end to a once thriving settlement. The burn marks and shattered walls matched the poetic descriptions of a city consumed in a single night, giving weight to the belief that the legend contained a core of truth. Each new discovery brought the ancient world a little closer to modern understanding. Yet, the mythic elements remained just as important, for they carried emotional truths that archaeology alone could not reveal. The tale of Achilles' strength, Hector's honor, Paris' choice, and Priam's sorrow expressed universal themes that resonated across cultures. Even without perfect historical accuracy, the story captured the essence of human conflict and longing. The legacy of Troy continued to grow as artists revived the tale in paintings that filled grand halls, sculptures that stood in quiet museums, and plays performed on stages lit by soft lanterns. Every age found new meaning in the fall of the city, using it to explore questions about destiny, justice, and the cost of desire. In each retelling, the characters lived again, reshaped by the imagination of the storyteller. Modern filmmakers brought Troy to new generations who watched ancient warriors come alive on screens, their armor gleaming under imagined suns and their battles echoing through digital landscapes. Though the retellings varied, they all carried echoes of Homer's ancient voice, a voice that had traveled through millennia. Even in these adaptations, the core of the story remained unbroken. The city's name became a metaphor across literature and everyday speech. People spoke of Trojan courage, Trojan pride, and Trojan downfall as symbols that captured universal struggles. The wooden horse itself became a timeless image used to describe deception, cunning, and hidden danger. And so Troy lived far beyond its physical walls, its spirit carried into classrooms, libraries, theaters, and quiet moments when someone opened an old book and stepped into the world of ancient heroes. The story's endurance proved that human memory can outlast empires and that imagination can preserve what time seeks to erase. In returning to the tale, each generation renewed its life once more. As the modern age unfolded and technology reshaped the way people studied the past, Troy remained a central mystery that both scholars and dreamers continued to explore with growing fascination. The combination of ancient poetry and archaeological discovery created a bridge between myth and science that few other stories could match. Each advancement revealed new layers of understanding while deepening the sense of wonder that surrounded the ancient city. Researchers studied the trade routes of the Bronze Age and discovered that Troy's location placed it at a strategic crossroads between powerful kingdoms. Its position near the Dardanelles meant that controlling Troy meant controlling access between the Aegean and the Black Sea. This insight strengthened the belief that the war may have been driven by economic motives as much as by legendary romance. Clay tablets, found in the ruins of Hittite cities, referred to a place called Waialusa, a name that many scholars believed connected to the word Ilias, another ancient name for Troy. The tablets described political tensions, alliances, and conflicts that mirrored the world hinted at in the Greek epics. These parallels suggested that the legend of Troy had roots in real diplomatic struggles of the late Bronze Age. Metal fragments, pottery styles, and construction techniques found at Hisarlik matched those of Mycenaean Greece, hinting that the cultures were not isolated enemies, but part of a shared network of trade and influence. The artifacts revealed a world far more interconnected than ancient myths often implied. Through these details, the city came alive with new clarity. As archaeologists pieced together fragments of daily life, they imagined markets filled with traders, workshops echoing with the sounds of metalwork, and families gathering round hearths to share food and stories. They saw a place not defined solely by war, but by vibrant community life. These moments of humanity formed the true heart of the city behind the legends. In universities, scholars debated the reliability of ancient sources, comparing Homer's verses with historical data and considering how oral tradition had shaped the tale over centuries. They questioned how memory transforms events and how storytelling can preserve truths even when details become exaggerated. The study of Troy became a lesson in how cultures remember their past. Meanwhile, travelers continued to visit the site, climbing the winding paths to stand where ancient walls once towered above the plain. They gazed at the distant horizon, imagining ships approaching the shore or warriors marching along the dusty fields. For many visitors, the experience felt like stepping briefly into a world where myths still touched the earth. The modern city of Nanakali grew nearby, becoming a gateway for people who wished to explore the ruins. Museums displayed pottery, tools, ornaments, and reconstructed models of the ancient settlement. These displays offered a quiet glimpse into the lives of those who had walked through Troy's streets long before history was written. As scientists mapped the site with lasers and satellites, new structures emerged from beneath the soil, revealing the full complexity of the city's architecture. Defensive trenches, watchtowers, residences, and ceremonial spaces added depth to the image painted by ancient poets. The more that was uncovered, the more remarkable the city became. Yet even with all these discoveries, a sense of mystery remained, as though the spirit of the ancient city resisted being fully understood. The ruins held stories that archaeology could not decode, memories of emotions, choices, and destinies that belonged to people lost to time. The legend of Troy lived not only in facts, but in the spaces between them. Writers and philosophers reflected on the tale's endurance, noting that Troy survived because it explored themes that all people face: love, jealousy, honor, ambition, and the consequences of human desire. These themes transcended the centuries and made the ancient story feel close and familiar. In its fall, the world saw both tragedy and timeless lessons, and so the modern world inherited Troy not as a forgotten ruin, but as a living story woven into art, scholarship, and imagination. The city's legacy expanded far beyond its walls, touching literature, language, and culture across continents. Troy became a reminder of how deeply a story can shape the identity of humanity. While Troy's walls crumbled long ago, the heroes who walked its battlements continued to live through the stories shared across generations. Their names drifted through history like distant echoes carried by the winds of time. And though the poets focused on a few shining figures, many more stood in the shadows supporting the fate of the city. Hector remained the heart of Troy, an image of duty and loyalty that resonated long after the last flames died. He fought not for glory, but for family, home, and the hope that the city he defended would survive for the children playing behind its walls. In him, people saw the quiet courage that defines real nobility. Achilles endured in memory as the greatest of the Greek warriors, a figure both admired for his strength and mourned for his temper. His story reminded listeners that even the strongest heroes could be undone by grief and anger. His life carried the weight of destiny, and his death marked the turning of the war. Odysseus became a symbol of cunning and perseverance, a hero who succeeded not through sheer power but through intelligence and patience. His journey home showed that the greatest battles often take place within the human spirit. Though he survived the war, the scars of Troy followed him through storms and distant lands. Aeneas, once a quiet presence in the epic, gained new significance through the Roman tradition that saw in him the seed of future empires. His escape from the burning city represented resilience, and his wandering through the Mediterranean became a story of rebuilding after loss. The Romans adopted him as a father of their people, linking their destiny to the ruins of Troy. Helen remained one of the most mysterious figures in the tale, seen by some as a victim carried away by forces beyond her control, and by others as the spark that ignited the greatest war of the ancient age. Her beauty was described as both a blessing and a curse, capable of inspiring devotion and destruction. Her presence in the story showed how desire can shape the fate of nations. Priam embodied the sorrow of a king watching the collapse of everything he loved. His plea to Achilles for the body of his son Hector became one of the most human moments in the epics, a reminder that even in war compassion can rise above fury. His final night marked the symbolic end of Troy's royal line. Andromache, Hector's wife, represented the quiet grief of those left behind by war. Through her sorrow, the world saw the cost of battle carried by families and communities whose stories were never written. Her voice added depth to the tragedy, showing that legends rest upon the sacrifices of the countless unnamed. Cassandra, the cursed prophetess who saw the fall of Troy long before it began, stood as a haunting symbol of warnings ignored. Though she spoke truths no one believed, she remained steadfast, even as fate closed in on the city. Her story echoed through later cultures as a reminder of the danger of overlooking wisdom. The warriors, kings, wives, and children of Troy filled the ancient epics with more than battles and sieges. They brought a sense of humanity to a story that might otherwise have been only destruction. Through them, the world understood that history is shaped not only by victory, but by emotion, hope, and loss. Modern audiences continue to connect with these heroes because their struggles mirror the complexities of human nature. They felt love, anger, fear, and longing just as people do today, making their stories feel timeless and familiar. Their lives, though set in a distant age, reflect the choices and consequences that shape the world in every era. And so the heroes of Troy remained alive in the minds of readers, scholars, and storytellers. Each retelling breathed new life into their journeys, allowing future generations to stand beside them on the plains of Ilium. Through memory and imagination, their names never faded. Long before the archaeologists arrived with tools and maps, the land that once held Troy changed slowly under centuries of wind, rain, and shifting soil. Grass grew over ancient stones and wildflowers covered the places where towers once cast their shadows. The earth concealed the memories of the city, keeping its secrets buried until curious hands uncovered them again. The hill known as Hissarlik rose quietly above the plains, overlooking the waters that connected the Aegean to the distant Black Sea. In ancient times, this position had given Troy immense control over trade routes, making it both wealthy and vulnerable. Merchants, sailors, and travelers passed beneath its gaze, carrying stories and goods from faraway lands. The surrounding landscape still carried a sense of quiet dignity, as though the echoes of chariots and warriors lingered unseen in the air. The plains where battles were once fought now stretched peacefully under the open sky, touched only by the gentle sounds of birds and rustling grass. Nature reclaimed the places where armies clashed and empires mourned. Ancient texts described the region with vivid detail, mentioning rivers, hills, and sacred groves that framed the city like natural guardians. Over time, the rivers changed course and the groves vanished, but faint traces remained for those who looked carefully. Researchers walked these paths, trying to match poetic imagery with physical reality. The Scamander River, once said to have run red with the struggles of warriors, still flowed across the plain, though its waters now moved with calm slowness. Its gentle curves whispered of the days when gods were believed to have walked beside its banks. The river became a link between the modern world and the mythical past. The mounds and depressions scattered around the countryside hinted at ancient buildings long eroded by time. Small pieces of pottery, fragments of walls, and scattered stones suggested where homes once stood and where families gathered to share their daily lives. Each discovery, no matter how simple, added to the story of the city. The landscape around Troy held layers of history beyond the famous war. Other settlements rose and fell in the same region, each leaving marks in the soil that archaeologists carefully traced and compared. These layers formed a timeline stretching far beyond the age of heroes. Through these discoveries, scholars learned that Troy was more than a single city. It was a sequence of cities built one upon another, each reflecting a new era in architecture, culture, and political influence. This realization deepened the understanding of how resilient and important the site had been for thousands of years. The setting of Troy inspired poets for generations, not only because of the war, but because of the beauty and mystery of the land itself. The open plains, the distant hills, and the wide horizon created a sense of timelessness that matched the scale of the legends. To stand there was to feel connected to a world beyond ordinary time. Even travelers who knew little of the ancient tales felt something unusual when they approached the quiet atmosphere and the weight of the history beneath their feet created a feeling of reverence, as though the land remembered the footsteps of heroes. The earth itself became a storyteller, whispering fragments of the past. As the modern world expanded and cities grew, the hill of Troy remained a rare space where the ancient and the present touched gently without erasing one another. The site became a reminder that history lives not only in books, but in the landscapes that shaped it. People who visited often described a sense of calm wonder, as if the past was still listening. And so the land of Ilium continued to hold the memories of a city that changed human storytelling forever. Its plains, rivers, and hills remained silent witnesses to an age of myth and war, offering their quiet presence to all who sought to understand the legacy of Troy. In that quiet landscape, the story found a home that time could not erase. As the story of Troy moved from age to age, it became more than a tale of war, transforming into a mirror through which humanity examined its own strengths and weaknesses. People saw in its heroes the reflections of their own struggles, desires, and fears, and in its fall a reminder of how fragile even the greatest civilizations can be. The legend turned into a quiet teacher that followed humanity across every century. Writers explored its themes to understand the balance between destiny and choice, asking whether the fate of Troy had been sealed from the beginning or shaped by the decisions of those who lived within its walls. They questioned how passion could ignite conflict and how pride could lead even the brightest cities toward ruin. Through these reflections, Troy remained alive in the world of ideas. Teachers shared the tale with students who listened with wonder to the unfolding of the epic age, imagining the clash of bronze armor and the glow of torches against ancient stone. In this way, the story shaped generations of young minds, stirring curiosity about the distant past. Troy became a doorway through which many first discovered the ancient world. Libraries held copies of the Iliad and other epics, preserving them with care so that future generations could continue to read the voices of poets long gone. Scholars translated the works into countless languages, ensuring that the story reached people across the globe. The tale became one of the world's most shared cultural foundations. Musicians composed pieces inspired by the sorrow of Hector, the rage of Achilles, and the melancholy of a city in flames. Artists filled galleries with images of Trojan landscapes, each painting offering a new interpretation of an ancient moment. The fall of Troy became a source of endless creativity. People saw in Troy not only tragedy but renewal, for from its ruins emerged stories of survival like that of Aeneas, who carried his people's memory into new lands. This theme of carrying the past forward resonated with cultures that had themselves experienced loss and rebirth. The legend reminded the world that endings often lead to new beginnings. In quiet moments, readers found themselves imagining the night when the wooden horse entered the gates, wondering how it felt to stand among the cheering crowds, unaware of the danger waiting inside. They pondered how easily trust can be misplaced, and how quickly fortune can change. The story offered gentle warnings woven into its dramatic events. Tourists visiting the site of Troy walked among the stones that once formed the foundations of a city famous long before recorded history. They stood where watchtowers once rose, where warriors stood guard, and where King Priam may have walked in the final hours of his reign. The silence of the place carried more weight than any spoken words. The ruins did not reveal every secret, but they provided enough pieces for imagination to rebuild the world that once stood there. With each visitor, the legend grew stronger, as though the memory of the city fed upon the curiosity and wonder of those who sought it. Troy lived through the people who remembered it, and so after thousands of years, the tale of Troy remained one of the most enduring narratives ever told. It survived the fall of empires, the loss of languages, and the turning of ages because it spoke to something universal in the human spirit. Its story held beauty, sorrow, triumph, and wisdom all within the same arc. The fall of Troy was not the end of a city but the beginning of a legend that shaped literature, culture, and imagination across continents. As long as people continued to tell stories and seek meaning in the past, Troy would rise again in the minds of those who listened. In this way, the city found immortality beyond stone, fire, and time.